My parents left me off the family vacation forever. Then a security video changed their lives overnight. Me name Iseliner. And I never thought the people who were supposed to love me most would become the reason I had to rebuild my entire life. I was 34 years old when I found out, by accident, that my parents had been taking my brother's family to Maui every single summer for 6 years, and never once told me it existed. What I didn't know yet was that the same trip that broke my heart would also hand me the one piece of evidence that would finally make my family answer for everything they had done. I grew up in a small house in Sacramento, California, with faded yellow siding and a crooked mailbox my dad never fixed. My name is Rachel Coleman, and for most of my childhood, I believed my family was simply not the affectionate type. That's what my mother, Diane, always called it. Not cold, not unfair, just practical. My younger brother, Tyler, was 2 years behind me, and from the time I can remember, he was the one who got the new bike, the one who got permission to skip chores, the one whose report cards were taped to the refrigerator while mine were folded into a drawer. I didn't resent him for it back then. I thought that's just how families worked. Someone gets the spotlight. Someone gets to stand quietly beside it. The person who made that childhood bearable was my grandfather, Walter. He lived 2 streets over, in a small house that smelled like cedar and old coffee grounds. Every Saturday morning, without fail, I'd walk over in my socks before my shoes were even tied. And he'd already have 2 mugs on the table, one filled with real coffee for him, one filled with warm milk and cinnamon for me. He called me his little warrior, and he was the only person who ever asked me how school was going and actually waited for the answer. You don't need everyone to see you, Rachel, he told me once when I was maybe 11, sitting on his porch step after a birthday party where nobody remembered to include me in the photos. You just need to know your own worth before anyone else figures it out. I held onto that sentence for over 20 years. I didn't know yet how much I would need it. By the time I was in my late 20s, I had built a quiet, steady life. I worked as a project coordinator for a logistics company in Austin, Texas, saved carefully, and visited my parents twice a year. Driving 12 hours each way because flights felt like an expense I couldn't justify. Tyler, meanwhile, had married a woman named Courtney, had 2 kids, and somehow always seemed to have money for things I didn't understand: a boat, a lake house membership, private school tuition. I told myself it wasn't a competition. I told myself a lot of things. Then, 3 months ago, everything cracked open over a photo. It was a rainy Tuesday night, and I was scrolling through Facebook before bed when I saw it, a post from Courtney. A beach photo. My parents, 10 and smiling, standing next to Tyler, Courtney, and their 2 kids, all wearing matching turquoise shirts, palm trees behind them. The caption read, 6th annual Maui trip with the whole gang. So blessed, 6th annual. I sat there in the dark, phone light glowing against my face, reading that word over and over. 6 years. 6 years of a tradition I had never once been invited to. Never once heard mentioned at a single family dinner. Never once seen referenced in a group text. My hands were shaking as I set the phone down on the nightstand. Not from anger yet, from confusion. The kind of confusion that feels like the floor quietly disappearing under your feet. I called my mother the next morning. I tried to keep my voice light, testing the water. Hey, I saw Courtney's photos from Maui. Looked amazing. How long have you guys been doing that? There was a pause on the line, just long enough for me to understand she was choosing her words. Oh, it's just a small family thing, she said. Nothing formal. 6 years, though. Another pause. And then my mother looked, even though I couldn't see her. I could hear it in her voice. She looked past the question entirely and said the 6 words that changed everything. It was never really for you. I didn't say anything for a long moment. The silence between us stretched so far I could hear my own heartbeat. What does that mean? I finally asked. It's a trip for the grandkids, Rachel. You don't have kids. It just made sense for it to be Tyler's family. I hung up the phone and sat on the edge of my bed for almost an hour, staring at the wall. But what my mother didn't know was that this phone call was only the beginning. She had no idea that a question I asked, almost as an afterthought, about a home security camera at my grandfather's old house would end up rewriting everything she thought she understood about her own family.c 2 years earlier. My grandfather Walter had passed away. He left the house to whichever grandchild needs it most, a line so typically him that the lawyer read it twice just to make sure everyone understood he meant it exactly as written. Tyler assumed it would go to him, since he had kids and a family to build a legacy for. I didn't fight it. I told the estate lawyer I didn't need the house, that Tyler should have it. At the time, I genuinely believed it was the right thing to do. What I didn't know was that decision would matter far more than I ever imagined. After my grandfather passed, my parents had quietly kept a small storage unit of his old belongings, boxes of photographs, tax documents, an old rotary phone, and a security system he'd installed years earlier for insurance purposes, as he used to joke, tapping the little camera above his porch light. Nobody ever thought much of it. Nobody except me, apparently, because I was the one who ended up going through those boxes 3 weeks after that phone call with my mother, looking for an old photo of him for what I told myself was just something to hold on to. Instead, I found a hard drive. At first, I thought it was broken. An old external drive labeled Porch Cam 2019 to 2020 in my grandfather's blocky handwriting. Curiosity got the better of me. I plugged it into my laptop that night, half expecting nothing but static. What I found instead was footage, backed up recordings from the porch camera, spanning almost 2 years before he passed, and buried in one folder, dated the summer before his death, was a video of a conversation on his porch, my parents, sitting exactly where I used to sit every Saturday morning. Unaware the camera was even running, I remember my hands trembling as I pressed play. In the video, my father, Robert, was talking to my grandfather about the trip fund, a savings account Walter had apparently set up years earlier, specifically for family vacations. Specifically, according to my grandfather's own words on camera, so Rachel doesn't get left out again like she was as a kid. And then I heard my mother's voice, calm, practical, the same tone she used every single time she explained away my absence from anything that mattered. Rachel's fine on her own. Dad, she doesn't need to be included in everything. It's easier if it's just Tyler's family. Less complicated, my grandfather's voice, quieter than I remembered, but firm. Complicated for who? Diane. The room became silent in that recording, the way rooms do right before someone says something they can't take back. Nobody moved on that porch, and nobody in my family, sitting comfortably in their turquoise vacation shirts 3 years later, had any idea that conversation had been recorded, or that the daughter they'd quietly erased from their plans was now sitting in her Austin apartment at midnight, watching the exact moment they decided who mattered and who didn't. I didn't cry, which surprised me. I felt something colder than sadness, clarity. But what they also didn't know was that the same account my grandfather mentioned, the Trip Fund, was never closed. It had been quietly growing in a credit union account under my grandfather's estate, untouched because nobody besides the lawyer and I knew it existed, since it had been set up specifically in my name as beneficiary. A detail buried in paperwork nobody had bothered to read carefully after his passing. I called the estate lawyer. Mr. Alvarez, the next morning, my voice steadier than I expected. He confirmed it within an hour. The account, opened under my name, contained just over $84,000, specifically earmarked in my grandfather's private notes as for Rachel's future. So she never again wonders if she was worth including. I sat with that information for 2 full days before I decided what to do with it. I didn't want a screaming confrontation. I didn't want a dramatic scene at a holiday dinner. My grandfather taught me that real strength doesn't announce itself. It simply shows up, undeniable. and lets the truth speak for itself. So I invited my parents and Tyler's family to dinner. Nothing unusual, just a Sunday visit, the kind we'd had 100 times before. I cooked, I set the table, and when everyone was seated, I placed my laptop at the head of the table and pressed play. I watched their faces as they heard my grandfather's voice again for the first time in years. I watched my mother's expression change from confusion to recognition to something that looked almost like fear. My father stared at his plate. Tyler looked between his parents and me, visibly trying to understand what he was witnessing. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Everyone looked at each other because they realized, all at once, exactly what the video meant, that the exclusion I had quietly accepted for years wasn't an oversight. It was a decision, made deliberately, spoken plainly on camera by the two people who had spent years telling me I was imagining things. That my mother finally broke the silence. Rachel, that was years ago. Things were different. They weren't different. I said calmly. You said it again 3 months ago. Almost word for word. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply closed the laptop and told them about the account. About my grandfather's note. About the fact that I hadn't touched a cent of it yet, not because I was being generous, but because I wanted them to understand, fully and without excuses, exactly why it existed. He set this aside because he saw what you couldn't admit to yourselves. I said that I was always the one being left behind, and somebody finally decided to do something about it. I didn't need to humiliate them further. Their faces did that on their own. In the weeks that followed, I used part of that inheritance to do something my grandfather would have appreciated more than any speech I could have given. I put a down payment on a small house of my own in Austin, the first home I ever owned outright, with a porch just wide enough for 2 chairs and 2 mugs. I hung a small camera above the porch light, more out of sentiment than security. My relationship with my parents didn't explode into permanent silence, but it changed permanently. Boundaries I had never dared to set before became non-negotiable. I stopped waiting for invitations that would never come. I stopped auditioning for a place at a table that had already decided I didn't belong there. Tyler, to his credit, reached out a few weeks later. He hadn't known about the recording, hadn't known about the fund, and for the first time in years, we had an honest conversation, not about revenge, but about the way silence in families lets certain patterns repeat themselves for far too long. Sometimes the people who leave you behind aren't the ones who define your worth. They're simply the ones who teach you, painfully and honestly, how strong you can become without their permission. My grandfather knew that long before I did. He didn't leave me a house. He left me proof that I had always been worth including, even when the people closest to me chose otherwise. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever felt like the quiet one in your own family, like an afterthought instead of a priority, I want you to know your worth was never up for a vote. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more real stories about family truth and quiet justice, make sure you subscribe because there are more stories like Rachel's still to come.